Hey, this is Zach Log the Great, and I am here tonight with my friend Nate. Go ahead.
Hi. I wave.
And with Chris, and we are discussing the poem "The Blue and the Gray" by Francis Miles Finch. So, um, Nate started this off last time. Chris, would you care to kick off?
Uh yeah, it's a pretty good poem. I like that even taking place like much closer to the Civil War than like we are now. There is a sense of like this is all of us, not us versus them. This is something we went through together. Uh it's it's much more of a we went through this as a nation, not like one side's evil, one side's good, which could have very easily been the case, but also would have kind of stopped the whole we're one nation thing.
Yeah, which I didn't. I want to get into that part in a little bit more. But one thing I also wanted to mention. Apparently, this was actually written uh, about 3 or 4 years after the end of the Civil War, and it was written based on an incident um, in Mississippi where there was
Yeah,
a. Go ahead.
yeah, Columbus, Mississippi.
And the and there was a ceremony where where they were honoring their war soldiers, and then they did the exact same thing for the Union soldiers who were the people they were fighting. And so it's based on this isn't just pie, this isn't just a purely imaginary thing. When he talks about laurelling the graves of who you would think they would say is the enemy. No, this was something that actually physically took place. So
Yeah, I think that was the most moving part to me. Um, was it these are the women of the defeated. They're the conquered people. And so chances are that some of their you know it's not beyond the realm of possibility, we'll say, that some of their relatives, lovers, husbands, sons know, were some of the dead that they were honoring there. But, they also decided to honor, the dead of the conquerors, the hostiles. I mean, what we call the Civil War these days is known in the South as the War of Northern Aggression.
I actually did
In some
not know
places
that.
still is. Uh,
I had never heard that term until I moved down here. So the Northern educational system is successful at keeping that information out. Um,
so, well, hey, you know, when you're of the bloodline of the oppressor, what you gonna do? But but no. So the idea that these women are going to go ahead and honor these soldiers, it's kind of like, hey, my honored enemy. And it said some of the commentary I read about said they actually got the names and sent condolences and well wishes to the families of these dead Union troops too, saying that, hey, we understand. We understand your loss and it's terrible, and we're sorry that you had to lose your sons the same way we lost ours.
and it's one thing, just as like like looking back historically, and this isn't directly about the poem itself, but the context. Um, I read an article a few months ago on the blog of ESR, Eric S. Raymond, I think, but he's a programmer and just comments on politics and current events. And he said that you know after the Civil War, the North, the Victoria side, they had a choice to make, and and basically it amounted to, are we going to be are we going to be one nation, or is this going to be like the North and their conquered territory? And it absolutely could have gone either way, but you know if they had made the second choice, then they would have had the then basically you would have had a decades long probably you know basically resistance fight, and insurgency, that's the word I'm looking for, where
Well,
there's
yeah, well, thanks to the carpetbaggers, it almost got that bad anyway.
I have heard, yeah, I have heard some people say that that was yeah, it's again, in that same blog post, he said that people in the South today seem to resent the mishandling of the Reconstruction almost more than the war itself. So
Whoa. Gonna show my gray side here for a minute. Mishandling is an understatement, man.
I
Basically, Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, called for what he wanted to have is a just and lasting peace. Heal the wounds of this war that had divided us. But then he got capped, and then the guys
which
that came after him and started running Reconstruction basically wanted to just take over the South and be like, no, we're going to dispossess all of these people. We're going to try and make this a profit for us because they're going to pay for what they cost us. And
well, and the other thing is
shit.
they had the excuse of like, you know, you just killed Lincoln. And so like if you generalize that, then that becomes
Fair.
the reason why they're doing why they're doing these things. And so the misfortune of that particular act is hard to overstate.
Well,
So
Yeah.
especially because in a lot of ways, Lincoln's sort of the anti-Hitler. Like, as bad as Hitler is, like people kind of hold up Lincoln like on the opposite side because he just was a great guy. It's
well,
it's really hard to say a lot of bad things about him. Like even in Rick and Morty, to create like a balanced person, they have like a half Hitler, half Lincoln. So
Well, and the other thing, and I actually made someone kind of angry saying this elsewhere recently, but like assassination does wonders for your historical reputation. Um, like if I'm
Oh,
sorry,
savage.
but like
You're probably right, but
if Lincoln had to like Lincoln handled the war, and that was tough, and that was bad. Handling trying to put things back together afterward, that's probably in some ways that's probably tougher. And so if Lincoln had to do that, um, would he have the same kind of reputation today? And I mean, there's no really no saying, but I think it's debatable, at least.
no, but being associated with the guy that killed such a beloved person really does not help things.
Yeah, yeah. But so back to the poem, though, since we've dived off into the cultural things. One thing I thought was interesting. It's in the second line it talks about the fleets of iron, which was the leaving the river, and it's kind of interesting to look at that now because like today we think navy and we think big huge metal ships, but like these were the first time those were seen, and so like that line there is kind of an interesting like historical note almost, in that the idea that you have ships made out of metal was still kind of weird.
yeah.
What else? Oh, go ahead.
No, just honestly, the poem itself I really enjoyed, especially like the repetition of the closing lines of every stanza. Talking about
It's
how it draws such a direct comparison that this is the fate of all these poor boys that ran off, that marched away to fight. They lay beneath the same sod, just as dead. I thought that was actually really powerful.
Right. The last two lines, it separates them, but shows that what separates them isn't what's important. It's the way it's in which they're the same.
well, the other thing, and this is like, for those who don't know, all the poems I do on this channel I memorize before I record them. I do these from memory, and so I spend a good deal of time with them. Um, and one thing I noticed, and when you do that, you start to pick it apart, even if you're not like deliberately trying to. And one interesting thing I noticed, the blue for the north is rhymed with dew, which is at the very least harmless and possibly even could be considered life-giving. And the gray for the south is rhymed with day from Judgment Day. And so, like, if you wanted to look for, kind of undercutting it, this was written by a northerner. The southerners are kind of connected a little more with the judgment idea there.
Yeah, well, the South will rise again.
Oh boy. And just in terms of emotional reaction, the primary, my primary reaction to this poem is it actually makes me really sad because there was this sense, even almost immediately after the war, we're still brothers. It's awful that this had to happen, and there are wounds and there is pain, but we're still the same. And then today you have idiots trying to tear down all these monuments, immediately after which they're going to move on to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and basically anything that stands for how America was built is going to be torn down.
That's honestly, after I read the poem through the first couple of times, I basically sat down and wrote out like a short essay about it just to get my thoughts down, because it really, it kind of hit me to the quick with that stuff. Because, okay, also I read a couple of things around the same time period, like one of the things linked to Lincoln's second inaugural address, which I referenced earlier, but he talks about the war, which at that point was still ongoing, but was sort of winding down. The end, how it was going to end really wasn't in question anymore. It was just a question of how long is the South going to make it last. And so he's talking about, he talks about it as though the whole war was an act of God. Like, that this terrible thing, this, sin, this stain on the soul of the nation, this slavery, it was something that God had to judge, with fire and blood, like, an Old Testament plague almost, because it was such an affront, to what God meant humanity to be. And so that here, through this contest of arms between men who otherwise would, probably clap each other on the back and go have a drink and sing all the hymns they all knew together, or, bawdy tavern songs, they all knew the same ones, it would be,
whereas likely it's not
see
one
them,
and then the other later.
That's it. These guys, glaring down gun sights at each other because, we're wearing different color shirts. That's awful.
Well, and I think it is important to remember, like, a lot of the soldiers that would be doing the actual fighting, like, a lot of them probably weren't even rich enough to have slaves. Like, we're probably talking about people just trying to make a living. So it really would have been just the color of their shirt that's different. And
Well, and
I think one thing that's important when you brought up the Judgment Day being rhymed with the gray is it's not just any judgment, it's the fair judgment, the fairest judgment that you can have. This idea that God's going to judge you individually, not for the cause that you were associated with, but you as an individual. So even being caught up with sort of the cause as a whole, which, yeah, slavery is bad, but not everybody necessarily had a stake in that.
I don't know, Chris. Are you sure you want to be that judgmental? I mean, we're told not to judge. That's a pretty strong moral stance there. You want to walk
You
that
know
back
what?
a bit?
You know what?
I got a
I
better one
don't care
for you.
who hears me. Slavery is wrong.
Real wrong. Hashtag looking at you, ISIS.
That's starting to get, yeah.
Really?
Not that
But
way right now.
okay, what gets me though, what you're talking about earlier, right? This whole wanting to tear down monuments and whatever. And all this time, since the war, the dead of both sides have been honored because they said they were the price of this contest for the soul of our nation. Do we want to live up to the vision that was set out for us, or for the sake of convenience and, to avoid all this difficulty and tragedy, are we willing to let it go? And as it turns out, America would rather split itself in half with a sword and bleed for years on end and devastate half of its territory than keep people in chains. That is the contest that was decided. And these men on either side, be they, blue or gray, they bled the same color of blood. And when they met each other in the midst of eternity, I doubt they were enemies any longer. And it's their sacrifice that shows us, one, this kind of way that people can get caught up with a cause. Or, you can serve, good men can serve bad ideals, or that bad ideas can just be very attractive to some folk, right? And so that in the end, other, just regular old guys are going to have to come down from where they live and their families and bleed and die to put that bad idea to rest. And so to tear down these monuments, even to the guys that, we're in service of a terrible thing, that it dehumanizes half the situation. It makes it hard to understand why this had to go on. But in the end, each of those men, that wore the rebel colors, took up arms against, the United States, had a reason. And they were very human, very understandable reasons. Right. And so to destroy the legacy of what was done, both in the name of liberty and the name of oppression, it just sets the stage to have to do it all again. And I keep just kind of running over you, Chris. I'm sorry. I will stop in just another minute. But like I said, we can't afford to go through this again. Okay, we could deal with it in the past because we were an isolated, little nation, kind of off on the fringe of world politics. We were getting ready to be important, but we really weren't yet. Now, it doesn't bear thinking about what would happen if America decided to go to war against itself. Because that leaves a vacuum that there's really nobody left big enough to fill except for a collection of jackasses that definitely do not have freedom and liberty and justice as, their core tenets that they're willing to bleed for. They have power and not much else.
Yeah. I mean, I think no, that's not true. I think even a lot of more libertarian-minded people who are, upset with, U.S. foreign policy and, you know, aggressive tendencies worldwide. Like, okay, we're not perfect. We make a mess sometimes, but have you looked at who else is out there and how they will run things? Like, if the U.S. is taken out of position, like we're not perfect, and you know, I'm sure we cause harm, but good Lord, like China, look at what they do to their own people. And how are they gonna treat, another country if they, yeah. Anyway, Chris, I think you've been trying to say something for a little bit.
Well, I was going to say it makes a certain amount of sense when you're in war to demonize your opponent. Mainly because if you've decided that it's gotten to the point where one group of people has to murder another, I don't think that humans inherently want to do that. We recognize people as people. So it makes sense to sort of demonize your opponents because otherwise you're not going to want to fight them. But if you're trying to create an actual peace, you've got to stop that and actually go the opposite direction. And by like tearing down monuments, by trying to continue to demonize the people that were already defeated, it definitely works against that. But I think it does create the idea, well, those people are obviously evil and I'm not obviously evil. So
yes.
So I can't possibly be the bad guy. I think humanizing the enemy afterwards, it allows you to reconnect and realize, wait a second, these were normal people that just believed in something that got out of hand. It's very easy to fall into that trap yourself. And creating such a strong dichotomy, you suddenly don't have to consider your own actions because whatever you're supporting is the good and whoever is against you is the bad.
Right.
Yeah, and
so
there's...
I think...
Go ahead.
So I think that's the most telling line to me, with reference to the modern situation, is that it's actions like these, it's these human acknowledgments of tragedy on both sides that, it sheathes the sword of anger, I believe is what what the poet said.
They banish our anger forever when they laurel the graves of
our anger forever, right? But these days, people are trying to, probe old wounds, so that the cry of war may once again sever. And
there's
for the life of me, I can't figure out why.
Because now I can't attribute to a lot of the individual actors, but the movement as a whole, I think it's pretty clear to me that actually destroying the United States as it stands today is a pretty high level goal. But one thing,
this is going to be a hard thing to keep from going political, and I think we have failed comprehensively.
Yeah, I don't care. I
think we lost.
My channel as a whole,
Chris? Oh,
I'm still here.
My channel as a whole is political, so it's I'm fine with that. But one thing, and I actually want to do a video about this, before long. Like if you look at how the German nation was treated after World War One, like what was done to them, what was required of them, and they had the war guilt clause in the treaty. I'll have to look up who said this because it's just a terrifyingly accurate quote. When the Treaty of Versailles was being signed, one of the diplomats, not from Germany, but one of the diplomats looked at it and said, "This isn't a treaty. This is a 20-year armistice." And basically he was saying, like, what you are doing to them, you are setting up the exact same thing to happen again in a generation. the way you are treating these people. And, the Germans were demonized, their economy was wrecked. And then, a generation later, you had a lot of angry young German men. Gee, what's going to happen when you have a lot of angry young men in a country that has been, yeah.
Not only that, but it's angry men that have been told that they're the fault, like they're the reason why everything is bad.
Yeah.
Like they're going to want to prove themselves. Like they're going to have that need to prove to everyone that they're not as bad as everyone keeps telling them they are. And
yeah,
that's just adding fuel to the fire.
Well, and another thing, from another thing you said, with gestures like this poem is talking about, like you said, that says that we had this fight, we had this war, and it wasn't pretty, but we are the same. Like there is something that unites us, and it acknowledges what a quote. There's a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose works I will someday have to read, some of them at some point. But he said, the line dividing good and evil goes through each human heart. And if you know that, if you understand that, it holds you back a little bit, because you can never say, those people over there are bad, they are the problem, and I'm good. And because guess what? I'm part of the problem too. I need fixed, I need sorted out, and there are things in me that are, harming, people I care about, that are harming the world as a whole. And that seems like something that conservatives, that people on the right tend to understand a lot better. Partly because, let's be honest, the right as a whole is more religious than the left. And, if you're a Christian,
well,
go ahead.
To understand that you're harming something, you have to realize that there's a breach of standards. To realize a breach of standards, you have to have a standard of conduct at all. And that's where you run into an issue with a lot of these sort of leftist things. The only standard is, how does it feel? You can feel real good while doing a whole lot of bad.
And there's actually, I might actually look up, buy the book and do one or two of the poems, although, geez, the idea of memorizing them is disturbing as hell. There's a book titled The Führer Bunker by
Lord.
Snodgrass. Do you know what I'm talking about, or are you just guessing from the title?
I'm just guessing from the title.
And it's a book of poems from the point of view of basically high level Nazis. The guy was not a Nazi. He's not advocating for the Nazi party or anything like that. But it's you have to understand that what they did is something that is inside of you too. Like, the capacity for horrific evil is inside every one of us, and every one of us has to face that and fight it. And if you try to assign that to someone else, if you try to say, again, I'm repeating myself, I guess, but if you try to assign that to someone else, if you try to externalize it entirely, all you're doing is setting yourself up to become exactly that, because you're not watching, you're not keeping guard against those things.
Right. True. Like a lot of people like to think, oh, well, if I lived in Nazi Germany, I wouldn't have stood by while that stuff happened. Except that experiment's been run. We know that most people in that situation we'll stand by and let it happen. There are exceptional people that did some really amazing things within Germany to help the Jews, to do what they could to stop the Nazis. But most of the people just let it happen. A lot of them actively participated. So it's very easy from outside the situation to say, oh, yeah, I would never do that. But
And
within
yeah,
each of us, there is that possibility. And you have to know it's there to guard against it.
and one other thing, to return to the American Civil War and leave the Nazis alone for a little bit, because they've been no, but if you look at this, the soldiers of the on the Confederate side in the American Civil War, if you ask them, I very much doubt probably a quarter of them even would say they were fighting for slavery. Um, I'm pretty sure the vast majority would say they're fighting for their home, and they're fighting because they feel like someone else is attacking their home.
Right. Well,
And
I've read about Robert E. Lee, and a lot of what it came down to for him was he just thought of himself as a Virginian before thinking of himself as an American, which at the time was not a weird thought.
No, the idea of nationalism hadn't really come around as a historical force yet at that point in time.
Right.
You
We
know,
we were
you
a
you were
collection of
a guy,
states.
but you would be a Bavarian or a Tyrolean or something like that, not a German per se. Or you would be, I'm a Texan, or I'm from Virginia,
I'm
or
not sure that's
I'm a New York.
gone in Texas.
You may all go to hell. I am going to Texas. That's right, Dave. Yeah. But you said you would think of yourself as it's like, well, I'm a Jayhawker, I'm a Buckeye, I'm this, that, this other thing, right? You're not going to think you walk up, well, I'm an American. I guess maybe unless you're from Washington, because then you don't really belong anywhere.
I was just trying to think, at
DC.
what point did Washington? Yeah, I know. I was well. I don't think Washington State existed then, but
No, God, no. We hadn't hit that coast that hard yet.
but
We had some dudes
I
in
was
California. We had like a whole territory up there, but we didn't have Washington.
the quizzical look on my face was because I was trying to figure out when Washington D.C. assumed the odd status it has today, because it's not a state nor part of any state. It's this own little thing, and I'm like, was it? And I was thinking, like, was it that way from the moment it
Well,
was the capital, or
I think so.
I
okay,
believe so. I don't. Whenever
I
they were
think as
deciding where to put it, I don't think anyone wanted one state to have that power,
yeah.
especially because nobody had really worked out how this whole United States thing was supposed to work.
Well,
and
here we
that
are, a couple of centuries later, and we're still sort of hammering at that.
actually,
Well, and a lot of it was because one of the two main views happened to be attached to slavery, and like that was just such an evil that had to be just excised, that everything that was attached to it had to go with it.
so anyone care to go straight back to the poem, because I think we've wandered far afield. I'm okay with that, by the way. I'm not unhappy, but I'm wondering if we
Honestly,
could get back to the
as
text.
a poem, right? Like I said, as just the text of the poem, structurally, sort of the mechanics of the poem, it's relatively simple. You have the images of battle and mourning, and then you have, trophies for the victors and the law, and then the symbols of loss applied to both sides, painted the same color with the same brush. And then, the repeating end of each, sort of the very repeating end of each stanza and all that. That's not, to my mind, a terribly complex poem, and the issues are right out there. It's still very powerful, very moving, but I think we've discussed, I think, the more important part of it, which is what's it talking about? What's the subject of this poem rather than just how is it done?
Yeah, it's one thing. It's interesting to me because I've done enough of these that I kind of have a comparison. And some poems for me are very easy to memorize. Some poems just go down like that. Um, and then others take a lot more work. And I don't know what the difference is, but like when I did Shakespeare's Sonnet Number Two, we talked about last week. Um, that was like I got that almost instantaneously. It took maybe a couple of hours to get that down. And this one was a lot more work, and I don't know why. I don't know what differentiates them, especially since this one is formal. It has rhyme and meter, which will make a huge difference for memorizing a poem. And that's you know there are some theories that's why poetry had rhyme and meter in the first place, because
Back
it
when you got your
helped.
oral traditions.
Yeah, and I don't know what the scholarship on this looks like, whether there's any proof, but there's some theories that for instance, the Iliad and the Odyssey were repeated by poets who memorized the entire thing, and that was how it was passed on for a long time until they developed writing and someone actually was able to write the entire thing down. Which, doing that with ink and the pens at the time, that's a kind of frightening thought in and of itself.
Well, they didn't have cell phones to get distracted.
Well, yeah. I really do wonder sometimes whether we're getting smarter or stupider in some ways,
Well,
and what technology is doing to that.
from what I understand,
it preserves the record of stupidity forever, but it doesn't change the.
Well, brains are lazy, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you're spending less time straight up memorizing things, you kind of have more time to look at how things are connected. So we tend to naturally outsource what we can. So our memories probably dropped a lot once we had writing, but that doesn't necessarily mean writing was a bad thing.
Well, and at the same time, like you're right. You're devoting less power to just remembering things, and we have an unimaginable, stores of inform. Like, from their point of view, just unimaginable stores of information available to us. At the same time, if the information is already in your head and just knocking around there, it's available to make connections. It's available for you to like connect A to B and combine them in a different way, which is in some ways how most interesting things come about. Taking things we already knew, taking things we already had, and combining them in a different way and combining them from a different angle, is how I think a lot of really great art and great technology comes about. So
True.
Which has nothing.
Not sure what it has to do with our poor war dead, but
like I said, we wander a bit. That's okay.
Shotgun sort of thing. I'm taking it.
Well, and I think it does go back to the poem, like, says what it wants to say without doing a lot more, and I think that's part of its appeal, because like it is very powerful because it doesn't try to hide anything. So I feel like if you're trying to talk about only the poem itself, like, I don't feel like there's a lot there, but sort of ideas that it evokes, that's kind of more where the power comes from.
Yeah, it's this isn't a criticism, this isn't saying it's bad, but at the same time this isn't very complex. Like, there's not a lot of things you have to pick apart. Like in a lot of Shakespeare's poetry, if you know, especially if know the etymology of the time, like there's a lot of things working all together, and you can pick just that apart for a long, long time. This doesn't seem to have that same kind of depth, but it does its job. Like I mean, it conveys the emotion, it conveys the feeling that it was meant
yeah.
to. So,
I mean, Shakespeare, a lot of these really, highbrow, really technical writers, it's like a bunch of little moving parts. It's an intricate machine. It's like a clock that's going to tell you something, but it's going to have multiple layers of meaning to arrive there. Where a poem like this, it's just a shovel. It's here to move things. It's dead simple, straightforward, and it's going to basically dig into you, pull out a scoop, and toss it somewhere else, and be like, "I've moved you." And that's all I want. That's all I cared to do. I didn't need to look like a genius doing it. I just needed to get it done, and it does a great job at that.
Yeah, and I have
Simple
no problem. So I think I've mostly run out on the poem itself. Anything else you guys want to throw in before we sign off for the night?
I think that's about it for me.
Okay. Well, it was good talking to you both, and God be with you.
Have a good one.
And with you.